Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time of the day you're listening to this presentation. Can I take this opportunity in the first instance, on behalf of your housing management team, to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to view this presentation in advance of your autumn conference on the 7th of October. We hope that as many of you as possible have registered to attend next week, but if you haven't, don't worry, there is still time, and please remember and encourage neighbouring tenants to participate as well. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview and background on how we work out rent level options in Perth and Kinross and what is taken into consideration. There is a lot of information within this presentation, but please don't worry, as we will cover some of the slides again at next week's conference, where there will be an opportunity for you to ask any questions or if you have any queries. We are not going to go into the detail about what each of the rent level options will mean for service delivery, as this will be the subject of next week's conference. Remember, you can watch this presentation as often as you like at a time that suits you. So, in the first instance, here is a quick overview of what we intend to cover in this presentation. Some of you may be very familiar with the process and indeed some of the slides, but for others who are perhaps joining us for the first time, it hopefully will let you see what influences the approach we take and the joint partnership working between ourselves and newer tenants. Believe it or not, this work started back in April 2021. We'll have a quick look at the charter outcomes, the budget setting process, tenants' priorities and feedback, pressures and savings, which we'll come on to, and we'll then look at the top level for the proposed rent level options, together with confirming the next steps. We thought it would be useful in the first instance to give you an understanding of how our average rent levels in Perth and Kinross compare nationally based on the information we submit as part of our submission for the annual return on the Charter. The first column shows this information by property size and then compares last year's rent levels and shows what current levels are in Perth and Kinross for this year. As you can see, before we take into account any increases which other providers made for 2021-22, we still compare favourably. We will look at this in more detail in relation to specific local authority comparisons later on. This slide shows the breakdown on our housing revenue account expenditure and shows how much of every pound of your rent is broken down and how it is spent across the services. In relation to repairs and maintenance, 31p in every pound covers this area, and that includes emergency repairs, day-to-day repairs, voids, adaptations and capital investment. 29p for neighbourhood services covers your locality housing teams, for example housing officers and housing assistants. It also includes sheltered housing, our allocations, housing options and some aspects of housing support. Financing costs amount to 24p. These are our loan charges for past and future borrowing of the capital programme. Contribution to the capital programme is 8p in every pound. You may hear this called CFCR. Support services are also 8p in every pound. So this is, for example, other services which support housing which aren't based within the actual service. So, for example, legal services or human resources. So, as well as being clear and transparent with you, our tenants, about how at a high level we spend your rent money, we actively encourage tenant involvement at a more in-depth level through our Housing Revenue Account Monitoring Group. This group was established in 2018-19 and is a partnership approach between volunteer tenants and staff. One of the first pieces of work the group identified was the need for an agreed consultation framework so that tenants could be aware of any plans to dispose of any assets from the housing revenue account and to have their say on taking this forward. Volunteers also scrutinise the housing revenue account budget spend, so they look to make sure that only activities which directly benefit tenants are being funded from the housing revenue account. They've developed an HRA scrutiny working plan. This is including areas such as budget setting and monitoring, employee costs, premises and transport costs, and income. And you'll hear a little bit more about this later on from Judith Barrow on another opportunity to participate. The Scottish Social Housing Charter sets out specific outcomes in relation to the way it expects landlords to set their rent levels. These are detailed under outcomes 14 and 15 and state that a balance is struck between the level of the services provided, the cost of the services, and how far current and prospective tenants and other customers can afford them. The money from your tenants' rents pays for around 95% of the services which we deliver as your landlord. Any changes to these services can directly impact on the cost and resultant rent increase levels. It is therefore important that we ensure we know what your priorities are and what this means for affordability. We will talk about affordability at next week's conference and the approach we have taken in Perth and Kinross over the last 4 years. This slide may be familiar to many of you. This is what we call our STEERS approach, or Strategic Tenant Engagement around Rent Setting, and this process was agreed in partnership with Tenants a number of years ago. Unfortunately, as a result of COVID, we had to adopt the approach that we took this year, and we discussed this briefly at our conference in June. In April 2021, we did manage to still issue all tenants with a survey around their rent setting priorities, but we had to base this on the feedback we'd received from our tenant satisfaction survey. We took the feedback from this and presented that to the online conference in June in terms of what tenants were saying to them was a priority when it came to the level of service and the way in which services were delivered to them. We would normally, over the course of July and August, look at delivering some tenant network events in localities, but unfortunately, again, as a result of the COVID-19 restrictions, this was not possible. We've continued to gather information from the tenant satisfaction survey, the rent setting priorities survey, and general feedback from tenants on the way in which we delivered services, and this has been used to develop and the level of rent options that are being proposed today. What will happen next is in November and December, rent proposal voting surveys will be sent out to all tenants to capture their preferred rent increase option. So how does the budget setting process work? The feedback from the Tenant Rent Setting Priorities Survey and the conference was then considered alongside service pressures identified by the Housing Management Team and is used to develop the Housing Revenue Account spending priorities for the next 5 years. We consider the impact of the pressures and the savings against the Housing Revenue Account business plan to assess both the short and long-term impacts and ensure the ongoing financial health of the overall service. These proposals were then submitted to our senior management team for consideration in advance of today when we are sharing this information with you. The previous slide highlighted how Housing Management Team will always look to identify savings within the Housing Revenue Account. It is worth highlighting that since 2016, the Housing Revenue Account has made £1.35 million of savings in the following areas. Our housing repairs transformation resulted in £500,000 of savings to the Housing Revenue Account. In terms of general efficiencies, so that is non-related staffing budgets, so looking at budgets that had already been set in place, that perhaps as a result of small transformations or changes in the way we worked, the budget was no longer required or needed to be reduced, has resulted in £342,000 in savings. Our commitment to ensuring that as many of our staff as possible are able to work from mobile working efficiencies has resulted in a saving of just £240,000. And income generation, so an increase in the level of income we're bringing in, has resulted in a saving of just under £270,000. So what are the proposed savings for this financial year? For this year, the table below shows the saving in terms of an increase in income from council house rents. The figure for 2022-23 is based on the lowest increase of 3%. The figures moving forward are based on our rent strategy, which we will talk about later, which looks at an average increase of 2.2% moving forward. We will, however, continue, as we do throughout each and every financial year, to look for any additional efficiencies or savings we can make in terms of improving the way in which we deliver services. As mentioned earlier, as part of the budget setting process, Housing Management Team look to identify any pressures on budgets in future years. These can be as a result of changes to our statutory requirements to you as landlord, requiring new or enhanced service levels, or general increases in the costs of, for example, materials. This table outlines these pressures, and as you can see from this, there are three which are directly linked to a general increase in the cost of materials or contracts. There has been a direct impact of COVID-19 nationally in relation to general increases in these types of costs. In relation to the first row, staff costs, these are set through the national terms and conditions, and Perth and Kinross Council has no influence over these. The proposed increase or pressure identified also includes the increase in employers' national insurance contributions, which comes into place from the 1st of April 2022. Bad and doubtful debt. This provision directly relates to the level of income and rent arrears. We look to have a provision for bad and doubtful debt or arrears which is within 5% of the overall income that we are due to collect. Therefore, the proposed increase or pressure identified is directly linked to the fact that rent levels will change next year following the outcome of this consultation. Movement in loan charges is simply changes to the level of money that we need to repay in relation to our current and future borrowing. EICRs, or electrical inspection certificates, will be a mandatory requirement for all our homes. So again, this is an additional cost and pressure on the service. We want to ensure that as a landlord and you as tenants, we are all supporting the climate change and zero carbon agenda. Therefore, a provision has been proposed to take this forward. There will also be an exciting opportunity for tenants to be involved in shaping this work, and Judy will talk to you later about that. We're proposing a one-off 50k increase to our tenancy sustainment fund, which recognises the ongoing financial pressures faced by many of our tenants as we continue to move out of the pandemic. We mentioned or talked about CFCR earlier. This is a contribution that we make to our capital projects. It is proposed that this is reduced next year, but this, I can assure you, will not impact on the delivery of our capital programmes or our existing commitments. Some of you may be aware that the Perth and Kinross Council has developed a 5-year rent strategy. This strategy is reviewed on an annual basis. Its purpose is to ensure that fluctuations, so changes in rent levels, will be minimised year on year. It provides a more planned and consistent approach for both the council and also tenants, so you know what to expect and you can plan for this. However, even though we have the 5-year rent strategy, we still undertake an annual rent setting process as we're doing it at present. The 5-year rent strategy was obviously developed pre-COVID. Before we go on to give you a high-level overview of rent increases locally and nationally and the proposals for 2022-23, we need to cover the proposals in relation to service charges. Some tenants who may be here today, as well as their weekly rent charge, also pay a service charge. This charge can be voluntary, for example submitting an application to be part of the garden maintenance scheme, or can be as a result of the home in which you currently live, so a retirement complex or a communal heating and lighting charge. This table outlines the current charge and the proposed charge for 2022-23. It is worth pointing out that we have to ensure that we have a full cost recovery for each of these services. So in relation to the heating and lighting charge for 2022-23, this is based on the actual cost of the service in the previous year. The charge in relation to heating and lighting is also applied to any private owners in the blocks, as you are tenants and the HRA should not be subsidising the cost of this. From this table you can see in most instances the charges have remained the same or have gone down from the previous year. Earlier in this presentation we looked at average current rent levels for Perth and Kinross and said we would look at increase levels on a more locally based approach. This table highlights increase levels over the last 5 years for neighbouring local authorities together with the national average compared to Perth and Kinross. I think, however, it is worth noting that the increase levels for 2021-2022 for all local authorities were driven by the impact of COVID, with a strong trend in most authorities for a low increase given the financial impact on tenants. However, over the last 5 years, Perth and Kinross has maintained a strong history in partnership with you, our tenants, of keeping our rent increases as low as possible while still delivering a high level of tenant satisfaction and good performance levels. This table shows you that we are almost 4% under the national average, and for some local authorities between 10.5% and 7.4% lower over the last 5 years. The table shows the overall increase over the last 5 years, with Perth and Kinross delivering the lowest overall increase locally and performing strongly in relation to the national average. This is testament to our strong partnership approach with tenants and our commitment to you as your landlord to deliver savings and efficiencies in the way we deliver services. So, the rent level proposals for 2022-23 are as follows. Option 1, a 3% increase. Option 2, a 3.5% increase. And finally, option 3, with a 4% increase. As I mentioned earlier, we won't go into the detail of what this means in terms of service delivery and investment in your homes, as this will be the main subject of next week's conference. What we can assure you, our tenants, is regardless of the option which is in the end chosen, we will maintain our current capital programme with guaranteed investments in areas such as 1.3 million for central heating, 3 million for rewiring, $250,000 for windows and doors, triple glazing, kitchen upgrades of 4.5 million, our external fabric of 6.7 million, and energy efficiency coming in at 2.3 million. So, what are the next steps? Well, we hope this presentation gives you the opportunity to consider the information provided and submit any questions you may have in advance of our live conference next week. Some of these slides, as I mentioned earlier, will be covered again at the live conference, as we appreciate there is a lot of information to take in. The final discussion and Q&A session will take place at next week's conference. To register for the event or to send us your questions or queries, please contact tenantparticipation@pkc.gov.uk. If you need assistance to get online, please don't hesitate to contact Kevin Heller on kheller@pkc.gov.uk or just call 07880 095411. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I would like again on behalf of the housing management team to thank you for taking the time to consider this information. We do hope that you can submit as many questions as you can in advance, but as we've said, we're always happy to answer your queries and questions next week at the conference. Thank you very much for listening.